Whispers from Below, a horror podcast by Justin W. Geis. Scary stories, both real and fake. Hello, listeners. Welcome to Season 2, Episode 8 of Whispers from Below, a podcast by a madman for madmen. I'm your resident psychopath, Justin W. Geis, and today's topic of discussion is King's Tavern. Now, before I get into the episode, this is a relatively okay episode, I think. I think most people are going to be okay listening to this. There is a little section in the middle that's probably going to be a little bit more gruesome than a younger listener might want. So just as a warning, this is a relatively okay episode. It's a haunted place episode. I know a lot of you guys really like those episodes. But just letting you know that there is a little bit of gory detail in the middle, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. There's a little bit of disturbing imagery, but for the most part, this should be pretty okay. But once you get to that part, if anything starts to make you uncomfortable, please skip it. You don't have to listen to all of it. And if this week's episode is not for you, please come back next week, and I will hopefully have something that you'll enjoy then. I try to switch things up every single week. That's pretty much it. So let's get into it. King's Tavern is an old bar that's located in downtown, I hope I'm saying this right, Natchez, Mississippi. Natchez? I'm unclear. Basically, this is like, it is like an outlaw town. It's probably not like that anymore, but way back when, this became like sort of like a passerby town, an outlaw town, and we'll get into it in a second, but that was sort of like the vibe of the place. It was like a smaller town, but this is where not a lot of people like lived here. A lot of people like passed through, if that makes any sense. It's currently open as a restaurant and bar, and it also teaches mixology classes. Again, due to like Corona and COVID and stuff like that, I'm unclear if any of that is still happening. I would assume probably not, due to like the current state of, affairs and everything like that. It's probably not open right now, but normally it is open as like a restaurant and bar. And I think you can also take ghost tours there on some days, or at least like when you're eating your food, they want you to like walk around and explore and sort of like look at all the rooms and see everything like that, because it used to be like an inn, so there's lots of stuff there. This is one of the most haunted buildings in the country, reportedly. There have been reports of seeing people there, lots of like EVP stuff from there, hearing voices that aren't there when you're staying there alone, like a lot of stuff like that. And we'll get into that a little bit later in the episode, but that is just something to keep in mind. As I talk about it, I'm going to go into a pretty lengthy detail about the history of the building, because I do think that the history of the building is very cool. It's a super, super old building. But then also, as we start to talk a little bit more about it, you'll start to see like where the history sort of plays into how it's haunted. As like, I feel like a lot of haunted places, you need to know the background to understand the state of it now. So yeah, this building was built in 1769. So this was built pre-revolution. This was when we were still like colonies. Like, wild that this building is like still up, like to me that's crazy that this building still exists, is still standing, is still used, like people still go there. To me, that's just wild. 1769. It is the oldest building in Natchez. It was made to be a blockhouse for the British fort that was nearby, Fort Panmure. It was meant to just sort of be like a place for like soldiers to stay. It wasn't meant to be like anything spectacular. Pre-revolution, there was actually no sawmills in the area for like miles and miles. So what's really interesting about how the building was built, this is like a fun, if you're like a little bit of like an architecture nerd or just a history buff, this is really cool information. So I thought I'd throw it in. There were no sawmills, so to get the wood for the building, they would put boats, like broken up barges and stuff like that. Because when the boaters would float down the river, they would get to this point and there was no way that they could go back, but that was kind of the end of the river, was at Natchez. So it was either like, well, I sell the boat and all of my goods and then like get back home, or like I try to go back up the river, but there was no real physical way to go back up the river. So what they ended up doing was selling the boats and all of their goods to everybody there, and then leaving and getting a pretty good profit. The boats were then scrapped, and that wood is what makes up a lot of the building. And they also used a lot of sun-dried bricks. So they would form the bricks out of like clay and mud and whatever, and then let it dry, and then they would put it together. This still remains very much how it looked way back when on the exterior, though a lot of the interior has been renovated. Still kept historical, but renovated to sort of give it a more modern vibe so that everybody can kind of enjoy it and not just like a history buff goes and is excited, you know? But a lot of the rooms are still intact with like original furniture and things like that, for, you know, spooky, scary purposes. Post-Revolutionary War, which was I believe the year that he bought it was 1789, I think. Yes, 1789, somewhere around there. Richard King moved in to this, you know, fort house, this block house. He bought it, and he ended up making it into a tavern and inn, and also it was the place where everybody delivered their mail and where the mail came in. So this became like a really popular place for people to sit and stay. The inn became super successful because of all the boaters and the stage riders that would end up like passing, you know, like the coach riders that would pass through. They'd be like, I'm exhausted. I don't want to go any further. Here's this town. There's only one inn. Let's go. You know, it became like this extremely popular place, along with the fact that it sent and delivered the town's mail. So like this tavern just became a place of like, people would hang out and read their mail, and they'd say like, oh, you know, maybe let's go to the tavern for a drink. You know, people stopping by would be like, where do we go to get a rest? And people would say the tavern. Like, it became this like basically like a crux of like the economy and the social structure of this tiny little town. And because of that, it also made Richard King and his family extremely popular with everybody. And it was known as King's Tavern at the time. That was like the family name. But then what ended up happening as this became a traveling town, you know, a town where people would just kind of mosey on through and then, you know, float away back to wherever they came from or move on forward, outlaws started to settle in the town. And around this sort of like 1790 to like 1800 era is when you start to see like really, you know, a really seedy underbelly sort of take place in Natchez, not necessarily with business or anything, but like, you know, a room's a room. If you can pay for the room, you're going to get the room. So that was sort of his thought. So he's like, if outlaws live here, doesn't really matter to me. So a lot of times people that were staying in the tavern had committed robbery, even like armed robbery. They'd been gambling. Sometimes they had even like murdered people and then stayed in the inn. And he was like, well, you're paying for the room and it's not my business to ask. So here you go. He still remained a very popular person because he was very objective with everybody and was like, well, I'm not going to ask this person that I've known for 8 years why they're staying in the inn when they have a home. I'm not going to ask this stranger why they're, you know, here. It doesn't make sense. Actually, a really fun fact. This is where, warning alert. This is where it's going to get a little bit more gruesome as I talk about the next sort of section. But the Harp brothers, who are these infamous murderers, criminals, actually ended up staying at the tavern quite frequently, normally after they had tortured and mutilated all of their victims. The Harp brothers, named self-proclaimed Mikaja, quote-unquote, big harp, and Wiley, quote, little, unquote, harp, were British loyalists. So Big Harp and Little Harp were these, like, British loyalists. So after the revolution, they were kind of like, well, fuck America. Like, I don't want to be here. I loved Britain, but I can't go back now because I was part of the revolution. So, like, I guess I'm staying here. So they became these, like, outlaws. And I think that sort of drove them to their, you know, insanity, their their psychosis. I love that word. I use that word in like every episode. But their like psychosis of like how they ended up being serial killers. They are like some of the first, like some of the earliest known serial killers. Obviously, like the one that you think of first when you're like, who was the earliest serial killer that we know of? You think of Jack the Ripper, which I am planning on doing an episode on. There's just a lot of info, so I'm sort of picking little pieces of info here and there to get ready for that episode. But get ready for that because it is coming, and I'm very, very excited about it. It might have to be a two-parter because there's just so much information about Jack the Ripper. Anyway, off topic. They supposedly killed at least 39 people that they had like linked to, but they had potentially killed about over 50 people in similar ways, making them some of the earliest known serial killers that we have seen in our country, which is really interesting. They were both eventually executed for their crimes, and that back then was way more normal than it is today. I mean, today it's like only the worst of the worst. Back then it was a little bit more like, you stole a loaf of bread, you're dead, like that sort of thing. I believe they were hanged, both of them, and then their heads were removed. I don't remember the reason for the heads being removed. I think they were placed on the side of the road where a lot of outlaws would rob people as sort of like a warning sign of like, this is what happens to you. I believe that was what happened. But I didn't do too much research into like their death because to me that was not as interesting as what they did when they were alive. They actually would reportedly even murder children or babies that had bothered them or made them feel uncomfortable in any way. The bodies were usually bruised, beaten, normally covered in urine, which I thought was like a really weird thing to notice about the bodies. And then normally the chest cavity was completely ripped open and filled with stones and then thrown in the river. So they sort of were like, they have a piss smell, like they're covered in like, urine, which like today would, be a little bit less, I think, noticeable, especially if it had been thrown in the river. I feel like back then, the piss smell could have been from like anything at all. So I don't necessarily know if they urinated on the victims or if that was just something that came from being in the wilderness for that long. I think today we'd have a little bit more knowledge about whether or not that was happening. But just something interesting to notice is that every time you look up that sort of thing, they have like urine involved. I don't know why. And then the reason that they ripped open the chest was to fill it with stones, and then that way they would be weighted down in the river and they wouldn't, the bodies would not rise up for a while. An interesting thing to note is that they were intelligent enough to weigh down the bodies, which is something that I feel like goes a little unnoticed with a lot of earlier serial killers. They're like, oh, well, they didn't have technology. You could get away with so much back in the day. And it's like, yes and no. They didn't have technology, but people were still intelligent. People still weren't idiots. There was a way to like go about, there was a process. There was a way to go about dealing with murder and finding the culprit and things like that. They weren't stupid. We didn't have like DNA, tracking and, fingerprints and stuff like that, but they still had ways to do it. And I think it was still intelligent of them to be like, well, we don't want people to know. It also shows remorse, which is very interesting considering that they butchered and like tortured these people for so long. It's interesting to note that they had like some sort of remorse for it, which is why they weighted down the bodies. Again, don't take my word for it. I'm not a criminologist. I don't necessarily know if what I'm saying is completely true or not, but from my research, what I've learned is that if the body is weighted down, it's for the purposes of keeping it away from the police or like being conscious that you've done a bad thing and knowing that you have to cover up. Or B, it's a sign of remorse of like, I want to make sure that this person is sort of like buried and not found, but like I want to make sure that they're like quote unquote like laid to rest. So it could be one of those two things, but just an interesting little tidbit. They reportedly actually murdered a baby and the mother in King's Tavern. And we'll talk a little bit about why that's important, but I am going to tell the story because supposedly the baby still haunts the tavern. I don't know about you, but I personally hate having to go to the grocery store. It takes up so much of my day when I could be starting a new hobby with that time, like soap carving, or collecting the sick bags out of airplanes. With Instacart, it makes grocery shopping fast and easy, all while allowing me to stay in my underwear. Instacart allows you to order all of the things you usually get from your local stores, delivered to your door in as fast as 1 hour. Not only that, but it will also give you smart suggestions for new items based off of your preferences, as well as highlight deals to help you save some money. The shoppers handpick perfect produce and make sure that your eggs get to you safely. You can get free delivery on your first order over $35 by following the link in the show notes. This also lets Instacart know that we sent you, and it helps support Whispers from Below. So if you hate grocery shopping as much as I do, try Instacart today and enjoy getting your groceries the easy way. So, with the invention of the steamboat, the tavern really was no longer as important because you could stay on the boat for a lot longer. So the tavern kind of like lost its jiggity jive, if you will, because people they just didn't need to stop anymore. You know, people were on steamboats. So there was no that town's need was as a town for people to stop when they were traveling. Now, because it was like right in the middle of two towns that were bigger and had more things, it sort of became not really a necessity anymore. So the tavern sort of lost its charm, its appeal to people. Richard King ended up selling the tavern in 1817, and it became a private home for 150 years. It was a private home to the Postlethwaite family until 1973, when it got sold to a local investor, who then ended up making it into a tavern again. And it reopened in 2013 under new ownership. So it's interesting that it then became a private residence. It's just a strange turn of events for someone in my brain to be like, that used to be a tavern and an inn. I'm going to buy it and make my home in it. Like, I wouldn't want that. Like, my brain is like, that's not a place that you should want to live with your family for more than a night or two. But like, became the family home for like 150 years. Like, clearly it served them well. Then I wrote in my notes, haunted as hell in all caps. What's really horrifying is that this still remained the family home after what I'm about to say. In the 1930s, they were doing renovation on the fireplace to sort of update it and make it look a little bit newer. And they found the skeletal remains of 3 different bodies hidden in the wall behind the fireplace. That should be a red flag that this probably shouldn't be your family home anymore. But they lived in it for like 40 more years. Like, I just can't wrap my brain around like finding bodies in my home and then being like, I'm okay. I guess we'll just coincide. Like, it would make me so like, I think most people, the gut instinct would be like, we have to move. Like, we can't stay here anymore. We've been living, we've been coexisting with 3 bodies that we didn't even know were here inside of our walls for like years. And we had no idea. Like, I would feel so uncomfortable. There's no way I would want to live there anymore. And even for me, I have a podcast about death. And like, I would feel so uncomfortable living in that house after that. They ended up staying in it for much longer. Anyway, I'm off topic. It was 2 men and 1 woman skeleton, along with a jeweled dagger, which they ended up thinking was probably the murder weapon for at least one of the victims. The men were never identified, but the woman is reportedly supposed to be Madeline, who was Richard King's mistress. The plot thickens. Supposedly, she had disappeared shortly after Mrs. King found out about the affair between Madeline and Mr. Richard. A lot of people believe that Mrs. King killed her and then hid her behind the wall. Who the other 2 men are, why they're there, who knows? What we do know, not for sure, but there's a lot of motive and there's a lot of evidence to prove it, is that Mrs. King murdered the mistress and put her inside the wall. A lot of the employees and the people that own the building still believe that she is the cause of most of the paranormal activity, the paranormal shenanigans that happen within the tavern. Her being Madeline, not Mrs. King. Um, People have reported seeing her in reflections in mirrors upstairs, along with having warm spots in and on the like in the bed as well as like above the bed, as though somebody had been like laying there previously. That is so unnerving to me. Can you imagine like a freshly folded clean sheets, you just checked in, it's this beautiful room and you lay down in the bed and it's warm. It's a warm bed, because I think we can all agree that one of the best things about crawling into bed is the sort of like cool sheets. It's one of my favorite things in the world. Like even if I'm cold and I'm trying to warm up, I do not want to warm up so much to where I don't have like a cool pillow or like a cool sheet on my leg. Like I just, that feeling I think is something we can all relate to. Imagine getting in the bed and it's warm already. The bed is already warm, but not everywhere, just in like where you're laying. That makes me so like, that makes my skin crawl. That is so wildly uncomfortable. Seeing someone in a mirror, whatever, you know. I know that sounds crazy, but like I feel like we've all seen that before. Your brain does things where it like, whether or not you believe in ghosts, spirits, whatever, your brain, you can believe that your brain would conjure up things like that. So the idea of seeing a woman in a mirror when you know you're staying in a haunted place, sure, whatever. But that, like it, oh my god, it makes me so uncomfortable. Oh, many people also believe that Wiley Harp supposedly haunts the tavern, along with one of his victims who is an infant. Legend says that a woman was staying in the tavern with her baby, and the baby was very upset, reportedly a rather fussy child. Little Harp got, that's Wiley. Little Harp got extremely fed up and upset with the noise, and so he went over to the mother, grabbed the baby, and threw it on the ground, killing the child instantly, and then butchering the mother. People have reported hearing a child crying upstairs when they know for a fact that nobody is up there. There is also supposed EVP of Little Harp himself at the tavern. If you look up King's Tavern EVP, you will probably find the clip that I'm talking about, of supposedly interacting with Wiley Harp at the tavern. He really liked the tavern and he frequented it with his brother a lot. So it kind of makes sense. I mean, he didn't die there, so it depends on your definition of ghost. If we're following Beetlejuice rules, he's not allowed to haunt that tavern because he can't leave the place he died. But you know, some people think that spirits move and walk and shift places that they haunt. So if that's what it is, he could have just gone back to a place that he felt comforted in, which could have been the tavern. Um, the room itself, there are a lot of reports of this upstairs room. It still has all of the like original furniture. I'm sure like the linens and stuff have changed or been updated or at least like cleaned and things like that. But it's all like the original stuff. The room itself just supposedly makes people feel, it raises your heart rate. It makes you feel uneasy. A lot of people have reported walking into the room and immediately feeling nauseous, which is just the fact that a room can even do that to you. Also getting chills when it's like 80 degrees outside. There was one report I was reading where she was like, it was like a review, I guess, of the place in a newspaper clipping, like a local one. And she's like, yeah, the steak was lovely. And, you know, it was 85 degrees outside. But when I walked in that room, I immediately got chills. I was like, that's wild to me. And again, like, it's tough now that it's one of the most haunted places and you can Google so much about it. Like, it makes it harder for people to have what I would consider to be like a genuine paranormal experience when you are walking into a place that you are fully aware is reportedly haunted. I think that leads to a lot of misinformation being spread, or people making up stories to sound cool or to have a fun story to tell people. I think that it creates sort of an issue with you perceiving things that aren't there because this is what you were told to perceive. It's sort of like what is that called? The Mandela effect? Maybe I'm using that incorrectly. But sort of where the conscious brain, especially, in America, since we know that this place is haunted, the collective brain in America has now said when you walk in, you get chills, you feel uncomfortable, this place is haunted. So then your brain is going to be like, I'm going to trigger these things because this is what's supposed to happen when I'm in this room. So I think that, like, take everything I'm saying with a grain of salt. If you feel like going there and seeing the stuff like this, do it. There have been tons of, like, ghost hunters that have gone there, and they've found the supposed ghost. There are some that have been there that haven't found anything. They've debunked it. There are people that have said it can't be debunked. It's completely haunted. Like, everything's kind of up in the air. Supposedly it has great steak. It's known for having wonderful steak. But I don't know. It's just interesting to think of the sort of thing that your brain can do. And I know this happened a lot. I was talking to a friend of mine recently, and I was trying to figure out, like, what future episodes do I want to do? What am I sort of interested in? And I wanted to do another haunted place episode. And I said, I'm thinking of doing literally anywhere in Gettysburg, because you step foot in Gettysburg and you can feel it. You can feel it in the air. You are not alone there. You could be alone on the street and you're not. There's so much haunted energy, like so much of this, like, I don't really buy into all this, like, spiritual universe energy stuff. It's not really my thing. But I remember being in Gettysburg when I was a kid and just being, like, absolutely overwhelmed by the amount of, like, things I saw and heard that were not there. Like, it was crazy. And kids are way more sensitive to that stuff because you have such a huge imagination and you're so young. A lot of people say it's because you're not, like, bitter yet. What's the word I'm looking for? You're not, like, senile yet. You're not at the point where you're sort of pessimistic. You're still very optimistic when you're a kid, and you're very, like, I'm open to anything being real. I think Santa's real and the Easter Bunny, So I think that's part of the reason why people report that. I think also you have a bigger imagination. You have an easier time sort of, like, grasping the concept of, like, a ghost. Whereas, like, when you're an adult, you're like, well, there's not a lot of science to, like, back that up. Like, we don't really know what happens. So, like, how can I believe that there's a ghost? Do I believe in ghosts personally? Absolutely. I don't like getting antiques. I don't like getting pre-owned things. It makes me uncomfortable. Clothing is a little bit different. I like thrifting clothes and things like that because I think that holds less energy than buying, like, a fully done table that somebody had in their dining room for 40 years and is now something that you can buy. If I can avoid it, I absolutely will. Sometimes that stuff is cheaper and you got to do it because you just don't have the money, and I totally understand that. I will avoid it at all costs because I am so nervous and uncomfortable with the idea of getting something haunted and bringing, like, a spirit into the apartment or my home, especially because I have a dog and my roommate has a cat. For those of you that don't know, dogs and cats can see things that we cannot. And it is horrifying when your pet is growling at thin air. It is so scary when your pet is freaking out at something that there's nothing there. It's a corner that's empty and they are freaking out at the corner. It is one of the most unnerving, hair-raising, chill, spine-chilling, blood-curdling things to just see a pet so, like, uncomfortable by something that you can't see. It's not fun. So I refuse to get things like that. And I think part of that is because I grew up in a house where I was told that ghosts were real. So I think there's something to be said about, like, again, this sort of, like, Mandela effect, bringing it back. I just went on a whole tangent, trying to bring it back, bring it round. This sort of effect of, like, well, I was told that ghosts are real. Now I believe ghosts are real. Now I see things that are supporting my view of how, creatures and things interact with ghosts. Same thing when you go to a place that you think is haunted. If somebody tells you that it's haunted, you're going to go there and feel uncomfortable. naturally because your brain is trying to look for the things that you've been told. So now that I've told you that this room is going to make you uncomfortable and feel nauseous, you might walk into the room and feel uncomfortable and nauseous because your brain is triggering the effects that are supposed to happen, especially if you believe in this sort of stuff, because it's seeing it as fact, as truth. And therefore, you must also participate in the fact and truth. It might help you see, Madeline in the mirror behind you. You could hear the baby crying and no one else will hear it, but your brain will trigger that effect. Do some research into stuff like this. It's like so fascinating to see. There was one show, I cannot for the life of me remember what it was called, but they did this really interesting experiment where they were like, okay, we're going to have 3 houses, and supposedly you can make people uncomfortable by sound that they can't hear. So like a certain frequency can supposedly make people feel way more uncomfortable. And I won't give away the results of it. I wish I could tell you what it was so you could all go find it. But basically the gist of it was that like they sat people down in each of the houses that were like spooky exterior but looked pretty much the same. But they played a different frequency in each of the house to see which one would make people more uncomfortable. And it was really interesting to see people's reactions to like, this is the one that's haunted. Because they didn't say, these aren't haunted, which one do you feel uncomfortable in? They said, one of these houses is haunted, do you feel the presence? And it was just very interesting seeing these people go through this experiment. I love stuff like that, where you're sort of seeing everybody like that. That was a really long tangent. I'm really sorry. If you want to hear an episode just more about that topic, sort of like ghost theories and how people sort of perceive spirits and seances and things like that, and also how people have debunked it in the past or used it to their advantage to sort of create a fake career, let me know, because there's tons of information about that. And as you can tell, I like talking about it. So if that's something that interests you and you got through that whole tangent and you were with me the whole time, great. Dope. I'll think about doing that episode in the future. Please let me know. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, or you just want to stay updated on stuff with Whispers from Below, like I know last week I was on vacation and so I didn't upload an episode. I had planned on uploading an episode and then time just got away from me and I didn't upload. So I let you guys know that there was going to be no episode that day, but I was going to come back this week. For updates and stuff like that, you can follow the Instagram and then you can DM me with questions and you can comment on the pictures and you can share stuff. It's really great and lovely. The handle is Whispers from Below. No spaces, no underscores, no capitals, no nothing. If you want to send any lengthier things or any sort of, I had one person that was like, I want to send you like sort of like a document of like ideas that I had. And I was like, oh, that's super cool. You can shoot me an email. That's probably the easiest way to do it, which is whispersfrombelow@gmail.com. No spaces, no underscores, no capitals, no nothing. I am gonna take pictures in the like merch stuff. I just haven't yet. I look a mess. COVID has really taken it out of me. I've got some more personal stuff going on, and my roommate just came back like a week or 2 ago, and we're figuring out how to coexist in the apartment again, and there's all sorts of stuff happening behind the scenes. So I will take pictures in that eventually. I just don't know if it's going to be right now. As far as anything else is concerned, updates and stuff on the podcast and whether or not there's going to be a bonus episode, just stay tuned. The best place to sort of figure out what's going on is the Instagram. I'm usually very close to my phone. I am a Gen Z, so I am usually pretty much within a couple feet of my phone at all times. So I will most likely see a message you send, or I will update as I sort of progress through this sort of thing. Some weeks I will upload a bonus episode on Thursdays. I'm thinking about starting a Patreon, if this is something that anybody would be interested in subscribing to, and then sort of doing a bonus episode where I'm doing more ranty stuff like I did sort of at the end of that episode, but as a little bonus treat for people that want to, support the show and things like that. That's pretty much all I have to talk about. If there's one thing that I can ask from you guys as a little bit of a favor, it's share this podcast. If it's through word of mouth, if you just want to tell one friend and say, hey, if you wouldn't mind just taking a listen. If it's on your social media, that's even better. I've had a couple people post on their stories like, check out this podcast, it's great. it makes me feel amazing. And then I get more listeners, and the more listeners that I can get, the more cool content I can put out for you, the more things I can do. I have really big ideas and aspirations for this podcast, but I really need your guys' help to make it happen. I know that sounds extremely cliche. I've heard so many influencers and people do that before, but it's true. I really need your guys' help in making this happen. If you guys can all just get one other person to start tuning in every week, that literally doubles the amount of listeners that I have. That makes me go from, like, let's say I have like 20 listeners right now. That makes me go from 20 to 40. Like, it's a huge jump. So if there's any way that you guys could do that, that would be absolutely fantastic. Remember, King's Tavern is super duper haunted. Mistresses, I don't think, deserve to die. Neither do babies while we're at it. Neither of those people deserve to die. And keep washing your hands, keep wearing a mask, and please stay safe. We're not out of the woods yet.